Why the Arabs don't want us in Syria. Can you give us the Cliff Notes version on why they don't want us in Syria?
The Cliff Notes is that we have a long history in Syria that is well known on the Arab street, but virtually unknown to the American people. Syria was a French colony, Tom, and during World War II, the people of Syria allied with the United States and fought against the Vichy government of France and overthrew it at the end of the war with our help, and then installed a democratic government. And then in 1949, we actually went in and overthrew that government because the president, al-Kuwaiti, refused to authorize a pipeline that U.S. interests were supporting. And then in 1956, we did the same thing again. They restored democracy. Again, we overthrew a democratically elected government. Those violent interventions by the CIA pushed Syria into the Soviet camp, and the history of Bashar Assad's close relationship with Russia really is rooted in those coups. People in Syria know that, but we don't know it here in the United States, so we go on blundering in the Mideast without understanding the terrain and the landscapes that we're treading on. This particular dispute, that the current Syrian civil war, is really an oil war. It's a war over a natural gas pipeline that was proposed in 2001 by Qatar, which has the largest natural gas deposits in the world, but can't get them to market. They wanted to build that pipeline from Qatar through Jordan, through Saudi Arabia, and through Syria to Turkey. And if they had done that, it would have destroyed the Russian economy, because the Russian now supplies 80% of its gas goes to Europe. And if that market is interfered with, this is an existential threat for Putin and for Russia. So Bashar Assad in 2009 said, we're not going to build the pipeline in respect to our allies, the Russians. Immediately, the Sunni regimes, the monarchies of Qatar and Saudi Arabia, began funding the Sunni uprising. They were joined by France, by England, and to a small extent, because Obama resisted, by the United States. But that Sunni uprising that they funded has now turned into ISIS. So those nations they took Al-Qaeda Iraq, which was the Sunni revolution in Iraq, sent it to Syria, funded it, armed it, and put it at war with Bashar Assad, who comes from a Shia sect called the Alawites. And people need to understand that those million refugees that are leaving Syria because this is a pipeline war. It's a war between two separate pipelines, and it has nothing to do with democracy. It has nothing to do with reforming the government. And, you know, if you look at Bashar Assad's record, he's kind of mild compared to other leaders in the Mideast. I mean, he doesn't behead people like they do in Saudi Arabia every Wednesday. There was a tremendous diversity. 80% of his army was Sunni. There was a good mix of Sunni and Shiite and Alawite all over that country. And it was not really a good target for us to be. You know, all of the people in that region have dirty hands. But this war had nothing to do with overthrowing a tyrant. It had everything to do with the pipeline.
So let me understand this. There were two competing pipeline proposals, both of which had to go through Syria in order to get to Turkey, in order to get to Europe, so that the natural gas could be delivered to Europe. One of those pipelines began in Iran, which is a Russian ally, went through Syria, which is a Russian ally, and then went into Turkey and Europe. So Russia gets...
But the Iran pipeline was a kind of a dead issue until around 2009 because of the European sanctions against Iran. So Iran couldn't really sell the gas in Europe. But in 2009, that all of a sudden became feasible because people could see the writing on the wall that, you know, a moderate government had been elected, and people could see that we were going to kind of deal with Iran. So there's two separate pipelines. One is a Russian sanctioned pipeline that goes from its ally Iran through its ally Syria into Turkey. The other is a pipeline that the Russians consider an existential threat, but The Turks loved it because they would get the transit fees and they would basically be able to control all of the gas coming into Europe. And the gas price in Europe would drop precipitously. Right now, the gas in Europe comes through the Ukraine and it comes through Turkey, but it's Russian gas. And the Turks, historically, have not really liked that kind of domination by the Russians. Putin has also used that gas to leverage political conciliations from Turkey and from the other Europeans. So for them, it was very attractive to have an alternative, which would have been Qatari gas. The Qataris, and for the Qataris, it would put them in charge of essentially of the whole European economy. They would be it would give them energy domination of all of Europe and a lot of the world if they could do that. So there was a huge stake for Turkey, for Saudi Arabia, for Qatar, and for the European nations, for France and England. And all of those nations got together and they funded this Sunni uprising. They took these Sunnis who had risen up who we basically drove out of their jobs in Iraq and formed the uprising there, and they targeted them onto Syria. There's a 2006 Pentagon report that says if we continue funding them, this group is going to start its own Islamic State in Syria. They'll start their own caliphate, and it will be a radical Islamic State. So the Pentagon knew what was going to happen. Everybody could see the future.
Is that why Obama was backing away from this and just letting the French and the British do it?
I mean, Obama really did, Obama did a good job of resisting tremendous pressure from Congress and from the European allies and from our allies in the Mideast, from the Saudis and from the Qataris, who have been, Qatar are the biggest American ally in the Mideast. We have bases all over Qatar. We have the biggest base, and a central command in the Mideast is in Qatar. They're very, very closely allied with the United States, and they wanted our help, and they got some of it. We trained a lot of these insurgents, these Sunni insurgents, at our bases in Qatar before sending them into Syria.
So we trained ISIS, basically? We funded it? We trained it?
We funded, we gave weapons to these groups that have turned into ISIS. And this is one of the reasons that we've broken now publicly for the first time with the Saudis and with Qatar on what to do in Syria, because they want to go ahead and continue funding the radical caliphate, and we are saying no, we don't want anything to do with it. So the Obama administration is putting a lot of daylight between itself and the Saudis and the Qataris and the Turks. And if you look at why did the Turks shoot down a Russian jet, the Turks saw that we might make, because at this point, Obama's principal concern is stability in Syria and stability in the Mideast. It's no longer the pipeline. Right. The Turks were worried that we would sign a deal with Russia that would leave Bashar Assad in power. And one of the ways for them to foil that deal is to basically declare war on Russia by shooting down one of its jets.
So we've got Erdogan. We just have 30 seconds, Bobby. So the president of Turkey is trying to be the tail that wags American foreign policy?
Well, the Turks are the centerpiece of the region. They're the country that connects Asia to Europe. They want to be the transit zone for all of this energy that's coming out of the Mideast and going to Europe. And they would get very, very rich transit fees from that arrangement, from that enterprise. The Iranian pipeline would not go through Turkey. It would go through Lebanon to the ports of Lebanon and maybe under the Mediterranean to Europe. So they would bypass Turkey altogether. So that Qatari pipeline is absolutely critical for Qatar, for Saudi Arabia, for Turkey, and a lot of other people have an interest in it. But we see 1 million people leaving. That didn't happen in Iraq. In Iraq, the people, there was terrible disruption and there was mayhem and torture and killing and murders, but the people stayed and fought. You didn't get this huge refugee outflow. People wonder why we're getting the refugees, because the people in Syria know that this is not a struggle over democracy or control. It's a struggle between two superpowers. and that over their sovereign nation, and that they're going to have nothing to do with picking what kind of government they have. Somebody else is going to pick them for them, and that it's not worth dying for a pipeline war. So they're leaving. All these military-age men are leaving. Wow. Because nobody wants to die for a pipeline war.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr., thank you so much for the brilliant reporting and for coming on our program tonight.
Do you want a man for president who's seasoned through and through, but not so doggone seasoned that he won't try something new? A man who's old enough to know
and young enough to do.
Well, it's up to you, it's up to you. It's strictly up to you. But it's Kennedy, 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 Kennedy for me.
Kennedy, 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 Kennedy.
Do you want a man with spirit who is not afraid to fight?
A man whose record shows that he will fight for what is right.
A loyal man who'll bring the job a fresh new point of view. Well, it's up to you, it's up to you. It's strictly up to you. 'Cause it's Kennedy, 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 Kennedy for me.
Kennedy, 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 Kennedy.
And do you deny to any man the right he's guaranteed to be elected president, no matter what his creed?
It's promised in the Bill of Rights to which we must be true.
So it's up to you, it's up to you. It's strictly up to you. And it's Kennedy, 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 Kennedy for me.
Kennedy, 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 Kennedy.
Do you like a man who answers straight, a man who's always fair? We'll measure him against the others, and when you compare, you cast your vote for Kennedy and a change that's overdue. So it's up to you, it's up to you, it's strictly up to you. Yes, it's Kennedy, 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 Kennedy for me.